Well, welcome to this version of the consortium, and we are so pleased to have all of you here and our special guest, Professor Haraway from UC Santa Cruz, to be our visitor. I want to speak briefly about the chair she occupies in the speaking role, the Daniel J. Evans Chair, a position created for the purpose of bringing intellectuals and scholars to campus for the purpose of integrating their work, their ideas into the work of our first-year students. But you may know that Dan Evans was the governor who signed into law the creation of the Evergreen State College and was its second president, and has a very, very deep and strong heart for the college, and actually will be back next week for my inauguration. He will be a speaker, and I'm certainly hoping, students, that you will be able to join us on Friday the 22nd. It will be a great celebration of the college, celebration of its founders, and celebration of you, our students. We are very fortunate to have Professor Haraway here today, and rather than giving an introduction to her scholarly work myself, which probably would not be the wisest choice, we have one of our faculty, Miranda Mellis, who will introduce her to you and give you an idea of all that she has done in her career to address issues related to the Anthropocene. So please, faculty member Miranda Mellis. Thank you.
All right, hi everybody. All right, I have an introduction. It fits on one page. It's like 750 words. So big thanks to Ruth Hayes, Sarah Williams, Nancy Murray, Tricia Bateman, and the media folk again. And thanks to all of you for being here. I am startled and amazed, I must tell you, to find myself about to introduce our speaker, whose work so very many of us have felt formed and enabled by, within but also crucially far beyond academia. Like one of the mythic figures she posits to help us think our conditions, for me and for many of us, she herself is something of a mythic figure whose name evokes complexly embodied approaches to scholarship that combine reflexivity, rigor, and play, generating new powers and potentials for thought, resistance, and action. It is then a true joy and honor to introduce Professor Donna Haraway, this year's Daniel Evans Chair at Evergreen, a Distinguished Professor Emerita in the History of Consciousness Department and Feminist Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. In September 2000, Professor Haraway was awarded the highest honor given by the Society for Social Studies of Science, the J.D. Bernal Award for lifetime contributions to the field. And she is the author of books and essays too numerous to name here that bring together questions of science and feminism. But I'll name just a few of her titles of the last few decades. And forthcoming from Duke this year is Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulucene. In 2008, When Species Meet. In 2003, the Companion Species Manifesto, Dogs, People, and Significant Otherness. In 1991, Simians, Cyborgs, and Women, The Reinvention of Nature. In 1989, Primate Visions, Gender, Race, and Nature in the World of Modern Science. In 1976, reprinted in 2004, Crystals, Fabrics, and Fields, Metaphors that Shape Embryos. To hear just these few titles is to glimpse the imaginative tentacular, to use one of her keywords, and transdisciplinary timbre of Professor Haraway's projects. In her work, she challenges epistemological and disciplinary borders, in part by means of poetic figures and refigurations. She refigures famously the cyborg as a metaphor for resistance, and in her Cyborg Manifesto of 1983. A more recent figure she is thinking with is Cyborg's ancient oddkin, Cthulhu, the chthonic one, whose time, she argues, is still and always now. Both are ironic figures representing the courage to turn towards rather than falsely resolve or elide the trouble. Mackenzie Wark, a close reader of Professor Haraway's, has posited that in the face of anthropogenic climate change, we need an alternative realism that entails much more of the kind of wholehearted, cross-disciplinary collaboration and thinking inherent to Professor Haraway's work. Simone Weil wrote that contradiction is the criterion of the real. If we agree with this, then if we care to be realists of any kind, alternative or otherwise, we must engage contradiction while resisting that near enemy of negative capability, those pretenses of uncertainty and of not knowing that perpetuate climate catastrophe and the metaphysics of predatory coloniality. Professor Haraway's interventions are alert to the implications, effects, and non-innocence of classification and narration when it comes to description. After all, a compulsion to classify is part of what drove the Western construction of race. It follows, as our guest today has insisted, in a formulation that encapsulates ideology critique, that it matters what stories tell stories. The story that tells her story is a story of feminist anti-racist praxis, critically engaging technoscience, continuously re-articulating and examining received categories which structure scientific and social thought and inform or deform their impacts. Cthulucene, she writes in our reading for today, is a simple word. It is a compound of two Greek roots, chthon and kainos, that together name a kind of time place for learning to stay with the trouble of living and dying in responsibility on a damaged earth. Here she weaves language and time in a way that allows us to learn how to stay with the trouble, demonstrating the power of writing as action to have transformative effects. In her essay, A Game of Cat's Cradle, she proposes an ethical model of critical theory as a game of cat's cradle, a game in which a string is looped on the fingers to form an intricate pattern between a player's hands that can be successively varied or transferred to another player's hands, a game where playing with one loop, an infinite number can co-create infinitely. Opposed to war games as the received model for acquiring, parlaying, and wielding knowledge, this essay proposes that a game of cat's cradle can teach us how worlds may be made and unmade. Excerpts from the essay, which students in Literary Arts Toolkit read aloud to each other this morning. Cat's Cradle invites a sense of collective work, of one person not being able to make all the patterns alone. One does not win at Cat's Cradle, she writes. The goal is more interesting and open-ended than that. Well, we don't have majors or departments here at Evergreen, but if we were to have even one, I would propose that we call it the Cat's Cradle Studies Department. Please join me in welcoming Professor Donna Haraway.
Wow, thank you. I've often thought that introductions should only be heard by one's parents, who deserve these introductions in obvious ways. I'd like, first of all, to thank my hosts for inviting me to this lecture. I have a soft spot in my heart for Washington State and for the public universities of Washington State. My partner, my lifetime partner, grew up in Seattle, and his father was for many years committed to the University of Washington as faculty member and then as an administrator, and felt very, very strongly about the difficulty of keeping public institutions truly public. And so I want to affirm Evergreen State College, and especially that it has maintained itself as an experimental place, as a place of actual experimental practice and collaborative learning for all of its warts. I know Evergreen is not perfect, but I have former students of my own, one of whom is one of my hosts, Sarah Williams, and her colleagues, Ruth Hayes and Miranda Mellis, who really are the folks who invited me, and others have made this visit possible, and I'm very grateful. But another set of connections has also made this lecture possible for me, and it's my odd kin. It's my God kin. It's my kin group. Marco Harding is a senior at Evergreen College right now, taking the program that Ruth Hayes is one of the faculty members in. That's not turning into an English sentence. Marco and I have had discussions since he was practically haploid about the relationships of the sciences and the arts, and then of cultures. Susan Harding, Marco's mother, my friend and colleague and anthropologist, who has taught me no end of what it means to think seriously about how this thing called the secular gets made in constant, interesting frictions with certain kinds of Christian, both secular and non-secular, Christian colonial and other practices. The my kin group, Marco and me and my partner Rustin, who does public radio, natural history public radio shows, and Susan have met weekly, at least weekly for dinner for at least 21 years. So that the relationship of building kin with each other is a practice, and it's a little practice. It comes from cooking and eating and playing endless games of trains. When Rustin's mother had dementia and kept thinking we were changing the rules on her every time her turn came around. I remember Marco as a kid incredibly kind to my mother-in-law. Anyway, point being, my sense of building odd kin in this time of the tentacular ones, building on odd kin in this thing I'm calling the Cthulucene, the time of the ongoing entities of the earth. Phonic means of the earth, the ongoing beings of the earth, that their powers are not finished. And the stories we're forced to inhabit these days, the stories of relentless and profound anthropogenic destruction, alternatively named the Anthropocene, or my favorite term, the Capitalocene, about which we will hear more, that there are other stories that are storying now, and that we live in them and with them. And in many ways, those are the stories that can interrupt the deadliness of the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene, the stories of living and dying well with each other in the context of the many urgencies that we face. So that I think of this particular talk as about ecological threats and extinctions, but especially about ways of staying creative with and for each other. I'm especially interested in the alliances of biology, art, and politics. And my definition of politics is something like doing something positive in and for the world. One of the ways I think about what you have been doing at Evergreen in lots of different contexts is joining art, science, culture, and politics in order to produce people who are able, who are responsible, who have cultivated the capacity to respond to the actual world of living and dying well, so as to make possible ongoing flourishing, not a kind of reaching for an abstract future, not a kind of reaching for a technological fix to the problems, although science and technology are critical for dealing with the situations that we're in, also for pleasure. I think the fundamental reason for being of the sciences and technologies is their sheer vitality, their sheer liveliness. And I think insofar as we think of them as only instruments to solve problems, we are killing the knowledge practices in question. So I begin with a slide making odd kin in the Cthulucene with an image that's taken from a Filipino artist, printmaker named Geraldine Javier, who worked at the Singapore Print Institute for a year and did a number of prints around themes of transformation and evolution. Watch the way the image of the butterfly is repeated in the pelvis. Watch the way the fiber arts in the constructing of the vertebrae of the spine out of various kinds of wound fiber. Watch the way the butterfly at the head is made of dried and colored leaves. Watch the way what you think of initially as flippers are human feet. Watch the way the human and the butterfly are woven into each other in some kind of story of living and dying, some kind of skeletal, some kind of transformational and metamorphic. Watch the multiple metamorphoses going on in Javier's print, and then realize the many directions that they're going on, that the directionality of this piece of work is multiform. It doesn't have a single trajectory, even though it has a kind of verticality to it. The direction of flow and the way the lateral shapes work puts us in the world of the Cthulucene. Scene, by the way, those of you who read the introduction to my coming book know that the suffix scene, C-E-N-E, basically means the recent now. But it's from the Greek kainos, but I take it to mean something more than that, a thick, ongoing now, the now that collects up inheritances and makes ongoing possible, the kainos of times that are not reducible to an instantaneous present that is always disappearing into the past and for which the future is never here, but also never, always some inaccessible place of luring, but never here, and insofar as it's here, it disappears instantaneously into the past. That kind of instantaneous present is not the time of the Thulucene. The kainos of the Thulucene has a wholly different shape to it. Now, as you've already heard, I work under the sign of SF, not least because I'm a science fiction reader, and not least because I was a biologist insofar as I have any claim to expertise, which is quite shallow. I'm wide but not deep. Insofar as I've had any claim to expertise, it's biology. That's where my training was. I love the biologies. The domain of storying and fact-making and instrument-making and coming into relationship with the living and dying world of biology is dear to my heart. So I kind of condensed that into the notion of scientific fact, though it's much bigger than that. I needed an SF term. String figures, science fact, science fiction, speculative fabulation. What is made is not made up. Stories are really critical. I think most of the important practices in the world, most certainly including biology, are full of speculative fabulations that then are tested for their livability, for their ability to hold together. Speculative feminism has been my practice for as long as I've been a person of the women's movements that grew out of the 1960s. And then so far, we've gotten so far and no further. Okay? Virginia Woolf in Three Guineas questioned the necessity of war at a time when questioning war was truly not on, at a time when white flowers were being passed out to those who weren't in the military because they were cowards, at a time of World War I that not to support the war effort was to be a kind of a traitor. Think we must, says Virginia Woolf in Three Guineas in a very unpopular piece. Think we must is taken up by the Belgian philosopher Isabel Stengers and her friends and colleagues in a group called Gecko. I love that, with those amazing tongues that geckos have got and those incredible suction feet and extraordinary biodiversity in the taxon that the geckos belong to. But it's the Groupe d'études constructivistes, the group for constructivist studies. It's a collective of collaborative thinkers. Isabel fled Paris because of its elitist and competitive intellectual culture, and it has been for a lifetime of philosophy, of think we must, been committed to building communities, thinking communities, communities of thinking practice. Marilyn Strathern is the anthropologist of cognitive practices who gave me whiplash at a certain point many years ago when she said, basically, it matters which ideas you think ideas with. Okay? That from the point of view of a person who knew a great deal about Mount Hageners in Papua New Guinea and something about the way they did persons as individuals with hinges at the elbow more than the neck, that make persons not through reproduction, although the question of having sex was really never an important question, but who made individuals rather than individuals, so that a competent person, this is true across Melanesia, but she worked it through with her teachers in Mount Hagen. A competent person is composed in different sorts of ways with different sorts of hinges and different sorts of obligations to give back substance, like pigs or taro or what have you, and that individuals were, competent adult persons were individuals who took themselves apart in various relationships of transfer of substance, making and transfer of wealth. Thinking, making persons with that as your theoretical cognitive apparatus, not as your primitive anthropological object, but as your philosophical theoretical apparatus, which you then put to work to think the philosophical apparatus and the logical relations and the modes of production and reproduction of English culture. She never talked about the West in general. She was interested in the way English people think. And she would, among other radical practices, talk to English people about the way they think. And it was Marilyn who taught me that the notion of relatives, who we think of as kin, members of the family, were logical relations until the 19th century, when relatives move into a word to think about your cousin on the couch who might have just appeared at your front door and you didn't know you had, but who can now make demands on you, and vice versa. Relatives are people who can make claims on each other, and so are logical relations. Well, riffing from Marilyn, it matters what stories tell stories, it matters what thoughts think thoughts, it matters what worlds worlds. It really matters to set things on some kind of non-hierarchical plane so that ways of worlding can build a contact zone that might fall apart, that can reach into each other and interrupt each other with a little luck in interesting ways. That thinking one thinking practice at a time will get us nowhere, that the job is to build contact zones that matter. Now, my favorite storyteller is Ursula Le Guin. She was the one who taught me narrative theory, not my colleagues in history of consciousness some years later. I always tried to use their words in a sentence 10 times to see if I could figure out what post-structuralism was really all about. And I made mistakes. It was clear that I was using the words a little wrong. And I ended up sort of liking the mistakes because I grew up as a phenomenologist where the mistakes are the most interesting things you can make. And laboratories are little machines for making interesting mistakes as fast as possible. The problem is making the mistakes interesting as opposed to just, destroying your experiment. So it didn't bother me too much that I didn't understand actual narrative theory or really never quite got post-structuralism because I had Ursula Le Guin in my carrier bag, in my net bag. And I understood that Ursula Le Guin had taught me that our job as thinkers is to somehow engage in telling and changing the stories so that they are more livable, so that the stories aren't all about the hero with the first beautiful words and weapons who moves across Earth space and narrative space to kill the prize and bring back the bounty with the first beautiful words and weapons. And that's the story of the evolution of this thing that was still called man in those years. Calling it humanity doesn't much help because it just covers up the narrative structure. But Ursula Le Guin taught me that that storying is much more powerful and much more interesting than that, and that lives are lived along lines, along drainage basins, if you will. This is a picture out of her novel, it's hard to know what form it is, Always Coming Home. Le Guin teaches me about what my colleague Jim Clifford calls big enough stories, not stories that are too big, not stories that try to tell everything, but situated stories that can collect up what's needed here so that it can be given. And in Ursula Le Guin's way of talking about it, a shell that can hold a little water or a few seeds, that which can somehow be collected and offered and taken, that's the kind of storying that we need to be doing. We need, in other words, to be telling stories for resurgence on a damaged planet, for resilience, resurgence, the rebuilding of refuges. We live on a planet full of refugees without refuge, and this is a multi-species affair. Okay? My colleague Anna Singh talks about that geological period before the Anthropocene, if one wants to think in temporalities like that, this geological period called the Holocene, as that time when, in the face of destruction, refuges still existed that could repopulate areas when the glaciers recede, or desertification is, of course, going to occur, and desert plants are fabulous. And believe me, I'm not against deserts, but they don't belong everywhere. The Holocene is a time when refuges always existed in rather large land and sea masses in the face of the perturbations of that geological period. And there's some very interesting maps that show where the refuges, the biodiversity refuges were at various moments in this thing called Holocene. And that what the Anthropocene threatens to do is so simplify the Earth, so occupy the Earth in its extractivist projects as to destroy the refugia for biodiversity. That it's not change that's the threat, but it's the wiping out of the refugia, refugees without refuge. Surely we're seeing that in the Middle East, but we're seeing it across the Earth in ways that we had better be paying attention to. Now, Hayao Miyazaki, you saw a loop coming into the room. that is made up of 2 minutes of Nausicaa, the Cave of the Wind, winds, Valley. Thank you. Evergreen is like that. Not everybody would correct me, and then I would be making this mistake for the entire time. And this is the definition of a not interesting mistake. So the correction is really good. Okay. Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, in 1984, early Hayao Miyazaki, which has as its basic storyline Nausicaa, the young girl, the young princess who will come of age in the story, who is facing the 2 threats, the expansion of the toxic forest on the one hand, and the advancing, ongoing permanent war, militarization, armies on the other hand. Nausicaa alone enters the toxic forest and befriends it, and through a series of complicated and interesting parts of the story, finds that underground the toxic forest is really purifying the water. And that in the underground zones of the toxic forest, the water is accumulating in clean aquifers, but that the toxic forest is spreading through ongoing acts of hostility directed against it. And Nausicaa, through many adventures, is able to bring a kind of peace to the Valley of the Wind. The other part of the loop that you saw was Never Alone, a game I'll talk about a little more later in the lecture, that similarly has a young girl, Nuna, going on a journey to confront a permanent blizzard that threatens to wipe out all of life in the circumpolar north, to wipe out her community, a blizzard of unprecedented destructive force that surely must be driven by some kind of evil that she sets out to confront with her trusty companion, the Arctic fox. She's swallowed by a whale. She goes underground in all kinds of interesting ways. She faces the evil figure through many adventures and returns and comes back to her village, which, by the way, at one point has been all wiped out. Everybody's been killed. It's a very interesting story that I'll say a little more about later, but I want to use the Stories for Resurgence on a Damaged Planet to remind you that you watched this loop that juxtaposed 2 kinds of animation. One from 2013 and one from 1984. Both are coming-of-age stories of an adolescent person, a young girl. Both are adventure stories that take up questions of the people and of the land and the waters and the flourishing and coming into adulthood through somehow making peace with the earth. Okay. So the figure that I've got on this kind of amazingly beautiful slide, which is the real reason I've got it, is an omu, which is one of the creatures of the toxic forest that can become tremendously enraged. And people who kill insects are going to arouse the rage of the omu, whose eyes turn red and are extremely dangerous creatures. Nausicaa has a really good relationship with the omu, in part because she saves one of their kids at a certain point. She rescues a larva that's being persecuted. But the omu themselves are like humans, really, and like many other critters, that is to say, permanently larval. They are not ever physiologically fully adult. They don't go through the metamorphosis to the butterfly stage. They're never properly adult sexuality. They're always quite queer. They are juvenile forever, like our species, and like most domesticated species, and a number of natural species too. And any biologist has a really particular place in her or his heart for the larvae, right? And especially for the larvae who never become properly adult. It's my definition of humanity. Okay. So another way of talking about the way I work is that I tunnel in the Cthulucene. I'm interested in the underground spaces, the spaces in and of the earth, in the toxic forest. Or with my colleague Anna Tsing, I'm interested in the mushrooms and the myceli and the hyphae and the mushroom at the end of the world, which tells her about the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. She tracks the matsutake mushroom and the supply. She's, among other things, she's interested in tracking the supply chains that feed capital accumulation, but that are outside capital accumulation, and whose workforce often are highly marginalized refugees, or in the case of the Pacific Northwest, Vietnam vets, Hmong, Cambodian, various peoples who will work other day jobs, like in Fresno during the winter, but who will be in the ruined eastern Washington and Oregon forest. The blasted and ruined forest is the scene of the flourishing of the matsutake mushroom in North America. The acid and rocky soils when the old growth has been destroyed. This is truly living on ruined land. And Anna is not interested in romanticizing this, but she is interested in how people and other organisms produce lives worth living in these scenes, and how to somehow inhabit these practices and these supply chains as a way of engaging in practices of making alternatives to capitalist extractionism, the possibility of life in capitalist ruins. Now, there are three stories in my talk. The Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, and the Cthulucene. The first story, the Anthropocene, is premised on the Apollo projects and the space race and post-World War II cybernetics. The Anthropocene could not exist as an object of knowledge outside systems theories and their instruments. It is a way of seeing the Earth from space. That the view from the moon, from the Apollo projects of Earth, is the point of view, it is the optics of the Anthropocene. That, I think, is very important. Now, I'm being reductive here for a reason. The Anthropocene actually has turned out to be a word that people both love and love to hate, and it's come to mean many things. So people inhabit this term in all sorts of ways that you might want to raise in the Q&A period a little bit that are going to be different from the way I describe it. But I want to do my rather strict Earth from Space my Earth from Space Anthropocene, and that Gaia. The planet is discovered to be a living, breathing entity with the integration of the rocky sphere, the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the Earth's airs, waters, and stratospheres, the respiration of the planet, the cycling of the elements, the cycling of the gases, that the planet itself is engaged in homeostatic circuits, that the planet itself, through its series of cycles and exchanges, can and does maintain conditions in various levels of its multiple spheres, which different sorts of critters can live. So it maintains conditions within tolerance limits within which, deep on those sea vents, thermophiles will flourish. But maybe in the Pacific Northwest, you can get old-growth spruce, and in California, you can get old-growth redwood and the associated understory plants. That you have tolerance limits that are maintained homeostatically. And this is a planetary kind of operation with very interesting local subcycles and sub-effects. And scientists, that's crudely speaking, scientists from many disciplines from World War II on have been studying these multiple feedback loops and cycles. And among other things, have insisted that cycles and loops can fail, that system breakdown can and does happen. And system breakdown can and does happen all the time, and is sometimes recoverable and sometimes not. And that one of the things that characterizes, let's say, the late Anthropocene, the ongoing destructiveness of it all, is the very real possibility that very large parts of the systemic loopings of the Earth will flip out into highly simplified reactions that might support jellyfish, but not much more in the ocean. That's one of the extreme imaginations. Is it extreme? That the possibility of serious flip-outs of this Gaia. This Gaia is a technological cybernetic entity. And if you've read John Varley's science fiction, Titan, Wizard, and Gaia, you will understand that Gaia is a technological device. She's a planet. She's a character throughout this trilogy. That's the Gaia of the Anthropocene. It's a cybernetic, systems theoretic entity that is studied and understood at certain kinds of scales capable of producing the global. So when we get the IPCC publishing its various reports on the state of the Earth, and you've got global kinds of system knowledge and giant databases, and the kinds of machines that can handle giant databases, and the sorts of expertise that can model in meaningful ways, and communities of practice that correct each other's models. That Gaia exists at a certain kind of global scale, this Gaia, that is intimately tied to giant databases and to internationally coordinated kinds of scientific and technological practice. This very cute, now seems like kindergarten sketch by James Lovelock of Gaia, the Earth System, was one of the early drawings for the feedback loops that do the Earth. The Earth is a performance. The Earth is performed by feedback loops. This is one of the early applications of cybernetic sciences to understanding what the Earth is. James Lovelock's colleague was the biologist, microbiologist, which really matters. She thinks the bacteria and the archaea did absolutely everything interesting on Earth, and anything that's happened since is fine, but the bacteria and the archaea already did it. Lynn Margulis had a very strong sense that everything interesting on Earth was in the cilia and flagellae and whiptails and cell surfaces and whatnots of the little guys. Okay, and she, of course, also had a theory of evolution, that large-scale organizational change, design change. We'll talk more about this in a minute. The kind of design change that turns a couple of bacteria into a complex cell with a nucleus and a bunch of other organelles is the result of eating and getting eaten and failing to digest each other completely. That the main system driver, design driver on Earth for the big changes like multicellularity and getting the complex cell in the first place and the rest of it was really a question of digestion and indigestion more than of sex. I think this is kind of important. Anyway, you see why I think it's kind of important. Now, there's another set of sciences that are proper to this period of time we're calling the Anthropocene. And it is the sciences of the modern evolutionary synthesis, put together crudely from the, somewhere in the 1920s to up to and including now. But I have a couple of, a few very prominent book titles, really important integration of understanding of evolutionary theory, its statistical models, its theories of natural selection, its understanding of fossils, its understanding of adaptation, its understanding of temporality, tempo and mode in evolution. And the modern evolutionary synthesis is based on a few rather simple equations, competition equations. You got to find the units of interest: gene, cell, organism, population, species, coral reef. Look for the smallest unit of interest for your particular question. You're looking for the smallest possible unit, and you're putting it into relationality with other units through a rather simple series of equations that come out of thermodynamics that are fundamentally competition equations. So relationality is pretty much defined in these sciences as, in the last instance, rooted in competition, a kind of game theoretic apparatus. So that's the reason that you find in what was originally called sociobiology, that's the reason you find various kinds of sharing and altruism and group phenomena explained away through reduction, which is actually a very creative process, through reduction to competition equations, so that at the end of the day it was really competition after all. Okay? And what these sciences did was phenomenal, and we cannot do without them. But what they didn't do is kind of big. They've never been very good at understanding microbiology. They've never been very good at understanding symbiosis. They really can't handle the more complex biobehavioral stuff, although they keep trying to do so. And they fail in really interesting ways at ecosystem levels of relationality. So that other units, other ways of thinking evolution have emerged that I will be talking about. So you can see why I both love and hate this thing called the Anthropocene, and why I want to situate it historically as a way of thinking. It has a time. It isn't all the time everywhere. The Capitalocene, if we were to have only one word to explain the destruction that we are in the midst of, I would prefer not to call it the Anthropocene, but to call it the Capitalocene. First of all, the Anthropos did not do this fracking thing. The Anthropos is not my friend. It's the Greek word means the one who looks up and wants to get out of the mud. And I'm really much more happy with the creatures who want to stay in the mud, the chthonic ones. But the Anthropos, or species Homo sapiens, or humanity, this extraordinary abstraction, did not do this fracking thing. This thing has a history to it, situated histories. Of course, human beings have interacted with their environment, such as to be destructive in various ways, as well as to produce various kinds of really interesting ecologies in which other critters thrive, thank you, and evolve into really cool beings. But our species, like most other species, produce these really interesting edge effects at the range of our expansion, and in these really interesting edges, all kinds of cool things happen, as well as all kinds of deadly things. Of course, human beings have been, since we have always been in and of the earth, of course you can look at periods of destruction that are prior to the last 500 years, and you can look at the origin of agriculture as the origin of the Anthropocene. You can talk about the extinction of the megafauna through human hunting practices. That's not a trivial matter. There are lots of things that need to be talked about, but they do not constitute the Anthropocene, I am arguing. And I think the Capitalocene, or possibly the Plantationocene, the practices of relocating germplasms, including people in the form of slaves, all over the earth in order to produce surplus that is then transported elsewhere for capital accumulation, precedes the Industrial Revolution. And indeed, the plantations of expansive European colonialism are the model for the factory system. So that the fossil fuel burning homo, who is making more fossils as fast as possible by burning fossils, the way of defining this homo is as fossil making man by burning fossils. Okay? That guy comes into existence on the model of the Plantationocene. And in fact, the kinds of machines that make the rum out of the molasses, there is a lot to be said for the Plantationocene and its 500 years, including now with the simplification of mangrove forest into palm plantations, with the ongoing extreme Plantationocene of the way we do industrial agriculture. It's not over, folks. So Capitalocene and Plantationocene are sort of my words rather than Anthropocene, because I think we're talking about, crudely speaking, a 500-year period, which is kind of short in terms of the history even of our species, much less the Earth. And what hasn't been going on very long can be changed more easily. How's that for an illusion? Anyway, I'd like to think that might be true. So I have as my slides for the Capitalocene the fact that the Northwest Passage in the circumpolar north of Canada and Nunavut, the areas high north of North America, it was thought that the summer opening of the Northwest Passage wasn't going to happen until about 2050, but it actually happened in 2013. And naturally, a coal-coking Danish-flagged ship was the first one to go across the Northwest Passage, and that was in 2013, way before anybody thought the melting was going to advance to that point. The fact that in the circumpolar north there is a multinational, highly militarized contestation among several nations, Russia and the United States and Canada and Norway and Great Britain and others, all of those who touch the northern seas, are engaged in a highly militarized, highly capitalized contest to locate and extract the last burnable calories on Earth, even while investing heavily in so-called sustainable energy matters, which are also profit-making. Wind and solar and wave energy and all the rest of it are getting big money, and well, they should, but that has not stopped the practices of going for the last possible calorie of fossil fuel on Earth. So that the keep it in the ground movement, I think, is probably our most radical, one of our most radical, keep it in the ground. The other picture is of Greenpeace approaching a Russian oil rig. Now, this slide is worth spending a minute or two on, and to do that, I have to get my copy. Actually, I can do this. These curves you have met in high school. They are called J-curves. Put some microbes into a test tube with bunches of food they like to eat, a whole bunch of sugar, and chart the expansion of the population of the microbes. It'll kind of move along slowly for a while, and then it'll really start expanding. And if you continue the J-curve and you don't add more sugar, it will crash. Okay? So you'll have the J-curve first, and then a period when all the resources have been used up, big trouble is happening, and population crashes. This is the logic of the population bomb discourse. Okay? And the J-curve looks like a natural fact. That's one of the part of the visual and ideological power of the J-curve is that it looks like a natural fact as opposed to a really interesting constructed technical object that can do some kinds of work, not others, and that does some work that would be better not done. Now, this work, I think, is better done. This is a 2004, updated 2014 thing called a dashboard by people who want to date the Anthropocene with the end of World War II, because they want to date it with the first atomic explosions. They want to date it with the radioisotopic signatures in the rocks, waters, and airs of the Earth. That these are the geological signatures, or from a Catholic point of view, stigmata, the wounds in the Earth. Okay? And that post-World War II is where things truly take off. It's when the nitrogen-based munitions turn into the post-World War II fertilizers and pesticides. It's when the projects of producing massive global profits for the winners, primarily the United States, although the Soviet Union was engaged in a really interesting way that finally economically collapsed. Many complicated stories. Point is that it's after World War II that you get a nitrogen-based and a radioactive-based means to expand just about everything. So that the increase in food supplies through this weird thing called the Green Revolution, the many increases, look at that, human population, real growth GDP, foreign direct investment, urban population, primary energy, blah, blah, blah. The inflection point of the curve is sort of circa 1950 for all of them. That's interesting. Those are supposedly socioeconomic, and the right-hand side is supposedly natural. There's a really weird nature-culture split in this slide that you guys, since you're from Evergreen, you had already seen that, and you already understood that this slide is doing ideological work to make you believe about the ongoing split between nature and culture, and the natural sciences and the social sciences, but you being from Evergreen are too smart for that. Okay, the Earth systems are really interesting. Watch the dates. You can't read them, but so you're going to have to believe what I say. These J-curves are very recent, these inflections. Well, gosh, I think that really matters in terms of thinking about what we've got to get a grip on and what kinds of stories we need to tell and not tell. Well, my third story is the Cthulucene. It's becoming with the tentacular ones. Tentari, tentaculum, to try, to touch. The word itself means to try, to reach, to touch, to entangle. This gorgeous octopus who lives near me, although I didn't take her picture, and I'm using it without copyright permission. Anyway, in my book, I have copyright permission anyway. I think it's fair use. Anyhow, point being, this gorgeous photograph of the Pacific Day octopus from Ocean-Wide Images figures for me the Cthulucene in some very interesting ways. The Greeks, hey, I'm a kid who grew up in this thing called Western culture, so naturally I appeal to the Greeks. I'm talking now about Bronze Age Greeks, and I'm talking about their interest in squid and cuttlefish and octopuses, and the way they thought these critters of the Middle Sea, these critters of the Western Mediterranean, were especially crucial to think with. Because they secrete darkest night. They're inky secretions. They secrete darkest night. They secrete not knowing or hiding or They escape through secreting night. Their tentacles form enmeshments and tangles. Their bodies change, they're polymorphic. They are mimetic to their background really fast. They can change shape like you can't believe. And they don't not only change shape, they change pattern, and they do it fast. Okay? Their sex is really cool. Anybody who took a marine biology course and got a little stoned and watched the squid mating, doing their deal at night, and the males, which are just pulsing with excitement, and they pull their little spermatophore out of their pouch, and they put it in a female pouch, and everybody is just pulsing like you wouldn't believe, and you're slightly stoned, and it's 2 a.m. You are really primed for the Cthulucene. You understand why the Greeks did it, were really impressed. Really impressed by these guys, Well, I don't think I'm going to say any more about the squid and the cuttlefish and the octopuses, except to say that they are mascots to die for, second only to gooey ducks. And I'm from Santa Cruz, so we're talking about the banana slug. And I got my sports writer father, who worked for a major urban newspaper and covered baseball, basketball, and football, to put a banana slug sticker on his car. That was love. That's good parenting. Okay, so staying with the figures and images of the Cthulucene for just a minute longer, the plate on the left actually is a 650 before the current era terracotta pottery piece from Rhodes that figures Potnia Theron, the mistress of the animals and the mistress of the bees. And you can see her tentacular kinds of arms. The mistress of the animals and the mistress of the bees is a Gorgon figure related to Medusa, the figure with the snaky hair. And patriarchal type guys who don't know how to greet her politely get, really bad things happen to them when they when they look in Medusa's face, because they have no idea how to greet the snaky-haired one. Now, I'm of the opinion that boys and girls of our species persuasion who know how to greet the Medusa politely are not going to get done in. But Athena, headborn of Zeus, talk about a non-feminist. Headborn of Zeus, never met a mother, and no mother, never, headborn of Zeus, always on Zeus's side, always working to make the Olympiad that is, sitting on top of Gaia, who's been domesticated by this time and given a lineage. Gaia's been turned into this platform for the Olympiad. Medusa does a murder for hire deal. Athena does a murder for hire with Medusa, and hires Perseus to go off and kill her and get her head so she can put it on her shield, to protect herself in her battles, including her knowledge battles, with the head of Athena on her shield. Well, interesting things happen, though, because blood drips from her severed head on the beach of the sands of the Western Mediterranean. And from that blood are born the gorgonia of the Western seas, the coral-like animals of the Western seas. There are all kinds of neat things that happen with Medusa, who happens to be the only mortal Gorgon. Medusa is my hero in part because she dies as well as lives. This is not about immortality. This is about a different set of stories. And Doctor Who, the figure of the Ood here, with the tentacle-faced ones who in their natural state, have a kind of hive mind, and they carry their hindbrain on their hands. But the slave-making species severed the delicate connection of the hindbrain to the rest of them and replaced it with a kind of iPhone 6, kind of telecommunicator thing, and controlled them through their messaging. And in this episode, Planet of the Ood, they are restored to their hindbrain and become a wholly different kind of species in various kinds of alliance with other heroes in Doctor Who. Well, those are the figures I think with in the Cthulucene. There are sciences proper to the Cthulucene. Remember I told you that the sciences of the evolutionary synthesis had a hard time with certain kinds of phenomena. And ecological, developmental, evolutionary biology, and the theory of and the various design system changes are high on the list of things that the extended synthesis has had a really hard time with, which isn't to say they haven't tried. And this painting, which was done after the death of Lynn Margulis by Shoshana Dubiner, called Endosymbiosis, or Homage to Lynn Margulis, stands for my origin of the modern cell. These are all real critters, although they're scale relationships. She takes great liberties with scale in this painting. But these are all real critters engaged in the kinds of events that Lynn Margulis and her colleagues and graduate students studied. And the fundamental insight of Lynn Margulis, in addition to being one of the inventors of the theory of autopoiesis and the Gaia that is engaged in these feedback loop controlled ways of living, a related contribution of Lynn Margulis is the origin of the modern cell through the indigestion of a couple of bacteria. So that the mitochondrion and other cell organelles, she has really neat stories about the way flagella and cilia come into the story, as well as centrosomes that cart the chromosomes where they're supposed to go when cells divide. How centromeres got into the story. Really elaborate and interesting accounts of the coming into being of the complex modern cell, which is just, I don't know, we're talking, I don't know, well more than a billion years, modern in that sense, and ongoing. Okay. Now, in Nicole King's lab, she has developed an exportable, that is, you can send it to your colleagues, a shareable experimental model system for studying what it takes to produce animal multicellularity. Watch the pretzels I tied myself into to avoid the word origin. Okay. Now I'm going to use it. The origin of animal multicellularity, okay, is studied in Nicole King's lab through a particular group of choanoflagellates, these really neat single-celled critters with long flagellae, flapping about in the water, infected by a particular a prey bacterium. One of the things they eat, one of their prey bacterial species, associated with them causes them to clump into morphological figures that then start doing things that make them act like organisms with two tissue layers, kind of sponge-like behavior. And King and her colleagues have worked this into a genetically well-characterized and an active site system and pathway, biosynthetic pathway, characterized research system for studying how animal multicellularity might have come about. That's a science of the Cthulucene. That's a science of what my colleague Scott Gilbert calls not the new synthesis, but the extended synthesis. And watch the way that both in the origin of the modern cell and the origin of animal multicellularity, what you've got going on is not autopoiesis or self-making, making a poem out of yourself, autopoiesis, but sympoiesis, making with. In order to have a one, you have to have at least a two, and the one is never just one. That becoming with is the name of the game, that sympoiesis is the mode of systemic relationality that needs to be storied and studied. Okay? It's making with. Okay? Margulis herself died before she realized that sympoiesis was better than autopoiesis, but I like to think she would have thought that, although she's not one for agreeing with you, ever. The next piece of Cthulucene sciences here has to do with developmental, how an organism becomes, from an egg gets to be whoever it's going to be in its life and death course, how development happens. And development is a relational thing that takes more than one taxon of critters to make it happen. Okay? So that your genetic endowment, which is a really interesting idea. I don't have any capital endowment, but I got a genetic endowment. The fact that political economy and natural economy share vocabulary, like endowment, is not an accident. It's a direct exchange of instruments of analysis. One really nice piece of that story is the way an analyst from the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company in New York moved to the School of Hygiene and Public Health at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore and developed the equations for studying the population structure, and life and death tables that, for example, have been used to study coral reefs. The fact that natural economy and political economy share instruments and languages is because of historical practice. Anyway, my genetic endowment does not determine who I'm going to be, that there have been interactions from pregnancy on with other critters of the microbiome mainly that shape the developmental program. For example, signals, molecules produced by one member of the relationship might be essential to the other member of the relationship to do what it needs to do next, and vice versa. That there's a kind of a collaborative sharing out of biochemical processes that go on. Now studyable, in part because the instrumentation of molecular biology and of information sciences are so powerful that it is now possible to study relationships that people would have loved to have studied in the 19th century, but really technically couldn't. The technical competency of the sciences really matters. Well, this is the story of the little Hawaiian bobtail squid. This is a blown-up picture of one of its little tentacles on the right. That's the Hawaiian bobtail squid. Hawaiian bobtail squid hatches, and one of the first things it has to do is get infected in the water, from the water column by a particular bacterium, which is only about 1% of the critters in the water column. So there's a selective infection. How does that happen? That's the first interesting point. Those bacteria then migrate through a little pore and start doing metabolic things that cause the squid to build a, forget the microphone for a second, that cause the squid to develop a ventral pouch. Fluorescing bacteria in the lifetime of the squid, and the squid is going to maintain the population dynamics of the bacteria. The bacteria are going to be secreting molecules that tell the squid what time of day it is, controls the circadian rhythm of the squid, the day-night relationships. And the pouch itself couldn't be built without the signal from the bacterium. So it's a symbiosis. What's the unit of selection here? Well, the unit of selection is what Scott Gilbert and others are now calling the holobiont, not the organism, not the smallest unit, but the relationality is the entity, is what is to be storied and studied. Call that the holobiont, all which has to be associated here in order to make any sense. In this case, to allow the Hawaiian bobtail squid to hunt, and its luminescing bacteria in its ventral pouch will make it look like the starry sky from the point of view of its prey below, so it won't be producing a hard shadow as it swims through the water to get its dinner. Squid are spiders of the sea. They're all predators. There's one vegetarian spider on Earth, but there are no vegetarian squids. Gilbert sums this up by saying we are all lichens. We are and always have been obligate associates, and that the biological world is cobbled together through the goings-on of these obligate associates that have different kinds of boundary relationships. They can form pretty clean, closed boundaries for certain periods of time, but those will always be local and provisional and practical. Boundaries become these really interesting practical operations. Well, Natasha Myers and Carla Hustak talk about this as involutionary momentum. They are interested in the ways that the biological world is full of sensual conversations, drawings together, the sensual attracting of each to each, that the biological world is full of sensual conversation, and that this is true at every scale of the biological world. Okay? And she and her colleague, Natasha and Carla, call this involutionary momentum rather than evolutionary momentum. And they illustrate it through the bee orchid, through the flower. Okay, here is a biobehavioral system that was explained away by competitive neo-Darwinism. The fact that orchids build their flowers to look like the genitals of the insects that they need to pollinate them, so that the beauty of an orchid flower is really the genitals of a female pollinator, and that it tricks the males into embracing the orchid and wasting all their reproductive stuff while pollinating the orchid. So it's cheating in the last. This is a textbook example of cheating in biology. Okay, and Darwin was absolutely fascinated by these relationships and had a considerably broader way of explaining than that. Contemporary workers are looking again at the kinds of attractions that are going on, and of course competition and cheating and all the rest exist, but it's a much bigger story than that. I think what's being said again and again by the artists and the biologists and the people that I'm playing with is that the story is more interesting than that. And that you have allowed the stories of war and competition to be the whole story, when it might be a wrinkle on it at a certain point in the biological or other process. Now, the cartoon that I'm going to have to read you, because you can't read it. This is XKCD, the cartoonist. Orchids whose flowers look like female bees. When males try to mate, they deposit pollen. This orchid, no bees land on this orchid because the bees that pollinate this orchid have all become extinct. Without its bee, this orchid is reduced to self-pollination, and that for these orchids is a dead-end evolutionary strategy. And this orchid is only going to be around for a while because its beloved is extinct. Its bee is extinct. So the idea of so the flower, nothing remains of the bee, but the idea of what the female bee looked like to the male bee as interpreted by a plant. Artistic. So the idea of what the female bee looked like as interpreted by the plant. Okay? So the only by a dying flower. And then the human stick figure says, "I will remember you, bee. Good luck." Well, I only have a few minutes left, and I want to spend that time talking about some art-science activisms, some interrelationships between artists and scientists to make a difference in the world in the Cthulucene. The crochet coral reef, which brings together about 8,000 people in about 27 countries in the Institute for Figuring in play tanks organized by Christine and Margaret Wertheim to make these hyperbolic shapes and produce fiber art reefs that bring together women's fiber arts, ecological activism, mathematics. The mathematics of hyperbolic shapes is very much part of this story. Bringing these things together without needing to go out and dive on the reef and touch a reef. It's what my friend Jake Metcalf would call intimacy without proximity. A very interesting kind of art, mathematics, women's fiber arts, international. These reefs travel, by the way. You can get a reef here in Evergreen if you want to. They do bleached reefs, toxic nightmare reefs. They crochet out of plastic bags collected off the beach. They crochet from abandoned reel-to-reel tape. They do all kinds of things to bring people into sensuous touch with what's going on in the coral reef worlds. My second example of art science activisms is the world game Never Alone, put together by a collaboration between the Cook Inlet Tribal Council, E-Line Games, and Number One Games to take an Inupiaq story told by Inupiaq storytellers and make a dynamite computer game out of it that was tested by the kids in Cook Inlet region. Several dozen kids were the testers for the computer game. There was an elaborate multiple-level collaboration, co-making that went on here to produce what the chairwoman of the Cook Inlet Tribal Council originally called a world game, a game of indigenous worlding that it can be played by others, but is here and not everywhere. It's a game about here. It's a game about Nuna and the Arctic fox and the spirit helpers who face the storm in their world and who listen to the stories. And as you get good enough at the game, you get little cultural insights. For example, one about Sila, which will often be in S-I-L-A, which will often be interpreted by Western hearers as, oh, that's what they use for climate change. That's the climate. That's the weather. well, Sila is the breath of the world that moves into and out of everything. Sila is a much bigger and more interesting idea than that. More than an idea, it's a way of worlding. You get that cultural insight if you don't die before you get there. The cultural insights are unlocked as you get better at the game, and since I die early and often, I have relied on Marco to get me to most of the cultural insights. That plus I went online and cheated. And all the cultural insights actually exist in little YouTube thingies so that you can die or you can continue dying early and often. But the main point of this game is to answer the question, what good are old stories unless their wisdom is shared? And then my last art science example comes from another place. Notice all my examples: coral reef ecosystems, circumpolar north that is experiencing faster ice melting, faster warming than any other place on the planet. There's a reason for that. Look at the angle of the sun to the earth and the way the seasons work and all the rest of it. You'll see why the fastest warming is happening in the northern hemisphere, high in the northern hemisphere. Circumpolar north, and my third example actually comes from coal country near in the United States West, in the Southwest, Black Mesa. Comes from Diné, Navajo, Diné, and Hopi land on Black Mesa. And the fact that the Colorado River water is moved across basins, over mountains and across basins, in order to feed the thirsty cities of the Southwest, Phoenix, so forth, that the water that feeds these cities is lifted across the mountains and down the next basin, and even turns around and goes the wrong way through the mountains in Colorado. It's Black Mesa coal. Okay? And the Navajo generating station, misnamed because the Navajos don't own it, is a very important scene of conflict and contestation over the people and environment of Black Mesa. And Black Mesa enters my story through the Black Mesa Water Coalition and through this march at the People's Climate Change March. Whoops. Thank you. These are Black Mesa Water Coalition activists in the People's Climate March in New York City in 2014. The Black Mesa Water Coalition is a group of mainly young, both Diné and some Hopi activists. Hopi have actually a separate activist group and various kinds of coalitional work that goes on between the Diné and Hopi groups that have been addressing several issues around the health of the Black Mesa. The ongoing forced relocation of the most traditional among the Diné from Black Mesa into prefabricated housing and the removal of their livestock, consequent upon the Navajo Hopi Land Partition Act of 1974, which basically was to remove the pastoralists from the land to open it up for unhindered coal mining and coal transport. The entire Navajo aquifer was drained to move the coal through slurries to the generating plants to generate the power that produces the cities of the Southwest. The people are moved, the livestock are killed, the lifeways are screwed up royally. And this is in many ways the third great extermination, the third great act of genocide, this one, the one from 1974 and following, organized around coal. The first great extermination in Diné Bequeya in Navajo lands, the Huildi, was the forced relocation of the Navajo to Bosque Redondo, several hundred miles away, and the killing of the cutting of their peach orchards and the killing of their flocks by the US Army as straight-up pacification and conquest history of the 19th century. The second Huildi, the second great genocide for the Navajo people and their animals, especially their sheep, was in the 1930s by the New Deal agricultural officials who, working with the supposedly scientific idea of carrying capacity, argue that the erosion of the land in Black Mesa and elsewhere in the Navajo Nation was the result of overstocking that had to be forcibly changed. And so they shot and killed, often in front of their families, the goats and sheep especially, And often the goats were the subsistence food that the women needed for the women and for their families. And women are very important owners of the sheep in Navajo culture. They broke up the matrilineal livestock arrangements, divvied up the land into head of household square units, and gave stocking permits, didn't recognize women as heads of household. All kinds of major changes, a giant extermination of the sheep, as if the sheep were responsible for the erosion. Okay? Now, the sheep exist in those numbers in Navajo land in that period, in no small part because wool woven into rugs by Navajo weavers was sold by the pound at the trading posts in a system of perpetual indebtedness, buying flour and sugar and a little cloth, whatever, a system of permanent indebtedness whereby rugs that took hundreds of hours of skilled weaving were sold as if it were raw wool, and then entered the tourist markets on the East Coast and in Santa Fe and elsewhere. And the families are forced to raise more and more and more sheep, produce more and more weaving that is at prices that are less and less capable of sustaining a people. Okay? So what I'm saying is that the ongoing extractivism and colonialism in the indigenous Southwest is the scene of some extremely vibrant art, science, people collaborations. And the Black Mesa Water Coalition is a piece of it. They have many parts to their program. They have a solar power project in the Navajo Nation. They have wind power. They have a wool buying project and sheep growing project. They've gotten churro sheep into the Diné College in Arizona. They were at Paris, at the Paris climate meetings in a big way. They have been extremely active in talking about what they call restorative economies. And all that it takes to have a restorative economy. And they have engaged with a foundation in Phoenix in doing a mural called Water is Life on the Valley Youth Theater. And watch what that mural does. You have at the far end, wait a minute. At the far end, you have the pouring out of the water that is produced by the coal mined from Black Mesa. You have the power plant in the back end. You have the sacred mountains. You have the woman with the twins, a kind of hero twins, but not the same ones as in the Navajo creation story, but the twins that represent the good and the evil possibilities. You have solar arrays, wind arrays, you have the sheep, you have the sustainable agriculture farm practices going on under the auspices of the Black Mesa Water Coalition. You have complex, vibrant, coalitional work going on to make the world livable. You have the building of decolonizing contact zones, maybe, where the nature culture, indigenous versus modernizer, Sila versus climate change, Husro, the Navajo term for harmony and well-being or right living, over and against carrying capacity or sustainability. You have the possibility of these things not being opposites, but just maybe in a contact zone for earthly survival under the sign of Patricia Piccinini's flying whale. She loves the idea that the udders are filled with a lighter-than-air gas that sustains this. This thing has a flying license. It looks like California, but it's Canberra. You can see the pilot down there in the basket. This thing actually flies. The sky whale. I love the idea that here we are in Evergreen where whales are important. The whales of the ocean are in the streams of the air, promising the possibility of contact zones. These are trans-contextual tangles where the string figures that are made together run in opposite ways but are still held together. This is a Diné Naklo string figure on Rustin's hands, coyotes running in opposite directions. These are the stories of the children of compost, the children who are Sims in building ongoingness as a possibility, where the speakers for the living and the dead are those we need. What I can't do, which you might ask me about in question and answer, is talk about the stories of the children of compost and the kinship systems of my own speculative fabulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Collaborative sharing out at Evergreen, particularly our Tacoma campus, a give back. We're going to transition from this give back into a question and answer. So, and watch this, folks. The glasses work this week. Ding dong. Woof. Ding dong. In this variation of the Tacoma campus's tradition of give back, following a guest lecture, I invite those of you with gifts for Donna to come with them here, or if you're in the ET or 110, to move forward to the mics. For those of you who are not with us week one, gooey duck skins were gifted to the audience for this purpose. Now, why gooey duck skins? Alejandro and I looked with you together through some of Donna's figures. We talked about Donna's thinking as figurations and at some of her most compelling thinking figures. And we gave them a sense of place, the genius of place. The gooey duck as our own chthonic, tentacular figure. We went back to 1971. Well, Al Wiedemann argued at one of the first founding faculty retreats, we have permanence, versatility, flexibility, vulnerability, non-aggressiveness, and we are ugly as hell. Gooey ducks are lucrative, currently $22 million, and gooey ducks are the largest biomass in Puget Sound. And a reminder on the etymology, which Donna's already spoken about, the tentacular, to feel, to try, to touch. But let's dig a little deeper. I suggested that Donna's thinking is tentacular, and that Haraway, Donna's work to the tentacular, is the same or could be compared to what thinking is to touch. And I also went back to some Greek origins. There are real consequences of working with Donna Haraway for years. Pick your graduate advisor carefully. Aristotle argued that synesthesis, which we now know as anesthesia, as synesthesia, it had an older meaning. It meant inner touch. And I invited us to think of perception as scaled sensation. And this is a question I left you with week one as we were anticipating Donna's visit. What would it mean for touch to be the root of thinking, and for thinking, in turn, to be in its most elevated form, a kind of touch? So here's what my program did, and I'm curious if anybody did anything different, and again, you're invited forward. What if touch is to thinking as taste is to mammalian evolution? Because when we played with gooey ducks, and we're about to taste them, a kind of involutionary mechanism or process comparable to evolution, Donna's reference to Margulis, it all began when something ate something else and indigestion happened. This is not a giant condom, or it could be used perhaps. It's not a balloon. It is the skin of the gooey duck neck that you were all invited to take last week. When you dunk a gooey duck to prepare for eating in boiling water, the skin unbelievably simply surrenders to you. It peels off, and you end up with this thing that, this is one of our Evergreen students in the terroir program, discovered you can do lots with. So the question, do we have gifts? I know we have at least one. Can our gifts come forward? And as they come forward, this is a thank you to Zen, who is a Vietnamese war bride who ended up in Washington because she followed a Vietnam vet back. And Taylor Shellfish has bought a restaurant for her in Shelton. So you too can taste Zen's food. Zen multiple times won the fastest oyster shucker in Washington State. So when she prepares gooey ducks, she has for weeks saved me the gooey duck skins, which is what I gave to you last week. So, do we have any other gifts? Okay. Owen and Aurora are here with a terrorist gift. It's terroir as gift. We're gifting back the fury and the beauty of Donna's thinking in her work, the thinking figure of the human, the Evergreen student geoduck as a proto-mammalian, as an oh-so-gorgeous, Gorgon-like, taste-savvy scavenger, and its odd kin. This is my nose. I think we need this creature to think with. The last time this planet had an extinction of the type we're looking at, it was the Permian extinction. Mammals arose from this critter. Its DNA is ours. The giant olfactory bulb, this thing on my face, was the precursor to this thing up here. The neocortex arose in response to this need to taste or be tasted. We were scavengers. Our proto-mammalian ancestors arose at this moment of absolute chaos on the planet. Thinking as a form of tasting, we're all part of the family synapsids, literally the beast-faced. A powerful image of neocortex evolution linked with olfactory bulb. Taste receptors are found every single place in our body. The geoduck Medusa, Owen and Aurora. And please come.
Oh my.
Usually made it.
Thankfully, there's nothing with which I can attach it. All right, I like it. In what vein am I supposed to give back now? I could be quite dangerous. Okay.
Donna's with us the rest of today. Events happening today, tomorrow, this evening, and an invitation to think. We've just seen a cast of amazing characters. You too can put together a group of students and faculty and invite an Evans Scholar for next year. So those of you that are in programs and that have welcomed Donna, we've got a couple of rich days ahead of us. Those of you who will be here next year. Huge gratitude to Daniel Evans for making this possibility happen, and Donna for being this year's Evans Scholar.
Well, and
thank
you.